welcome, and thank you so much for being in this beautiful space. I'm Devyani Saltzman, and I feel very honored to be a member of the curatorial committee for this year's PEN World Voices. PEN America is an amazing organization whose mission is to unite writers and allies to celebrate the power of the written word and champion the freedom to write. We are thrilled to be back with live programming after 2 years of virtual events and proud to present 30 events with over 80 writers. If you haven't looked at the program, there's things through to Saturday. Please go. This is the 18th PEN World Voices Festival, and since 2005, it has stayed true to its original mission to celebrate the power of storytelling and literature and translation, convene global voices from around the world, and celebrate language and culture. For those that are new to PEN, it's a member-driven organization, so please go to the back, to the table, check out the membership information, and think of joining PEN. We wanted to take a moment to thank our members, our Bookstore partner, The Strand, who are selling in the back, Norla, Norwegian Literature Abroad, who provided support for this program. And finally, to my fellow members of the curatorial committee, Clarice Rosaz Sharif, Eloisa Emezkua, John Freeman, and Louise Steinman. I'm almost done. I know it's a lot of chatting, but I'm really excited to introduce today's panel. This is a panel that is very dear to my heart about the rise of climate fiction with four incredible writers, one who is moderating, Emily Raboteau, Tochi Onyebuchi, Maja Lunde, and Alexandra Kleeman. A little bit about Emily. Emily is an American Book Award-winning author of Searching for Zion. She writes at the intersection of parenthood, social and environmental justice. She's a professor of English at City College of New York, and her next book, Lessons for Survival, comes out next year. She has almost exclusively been writing about the climate crisis since the 2018 publication of the IPCC report. Please give them all a big round of applause.
Thank you, Devyani. I wish to thank PEN for inviting me to moderate this panel. I'd also like to thank the chorus of activists and public intellectuals, including Robert McFarlane, Amitav Ghosh, and Bill McKibben, who started asking in the mid-2000s when literature would respond to current and future climate change with compelling narratives. And I'd also like to thank Yale professor Matthew Schneider-Meyerson for his empirical studies of whether or not the climate fiction published since that time has made a difference. These thought leaders helped me prepare for the role of moderating tonight's event with Tochi, Alexandra, and Maja, who I'm very pleased to introduce to you. Maja Lunde is one of the most successful Norwegian authors of her generation and a prominent advocate for climate change. She set out on a mission to raise awareness about climate change through her books that combine past, present, and future perspectives on the natural elements of the earth. The Climate Quartet series consists of 4 books. The first 3 of these are published and translated into English, most recently, The Last Wild Horses, and the 4th book will come out in the fall. Alexandra Kleeman has a most recent book, Something New Under the Sun, named one of the New York Times notable books of 2021. Her distinctions include the Rome Prize, the Berlin Prize, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She is an assistant professor at the New School. And Tochi Onyebuchi is the author most recently of Goliath. His previous fiction includes Riot Baby, a finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and NAACP Image Awards, and the winner of the World Fantasy Award. His short fiction has appeared in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy and elsewhere. I will now offer some introductory remarks, followed by our panel discussion. After that, there'll be a brief Q&A, and finally, a book signing. Climate fiction, sometimes called Cli-Fi, is a growing body of literature directly confronting the climate crisis. What was once the purview of hard-hitting journalistic nonfiction is now the shared backdrop of literary storytelling and speculative fiction. Authors are inventively finding ways to depict the glaring truth that the climate crisis, for far too long dangerously sidelined within cultural discourse, erroneously perceived as at once too abstract and too immense to bring into human narrative, is a cataclysmic humanitarian crisis. This century, the climate emergency has become with more and more urgency the subject of scores of novels, including those by these three talented writers. Through a range of forms, including social realism, satire, and science fiction, writers around the world have tried to represent the vast biophysical processes and unprecedented social and political challenges presented by the transnational, transgenerational problem of climate change. In line with Brecht's assertion that, quote, "Art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it," end quote. This generation's authors of climate change have sought not only to create something of lasting value or to bear witness, but also sometimes to agitate and inspire apathetic and complicit readers. These works no longer present disruptions of weather systems and human lives as distant prospects, but immediate, urgent, and tangible problems. The appearance of what has become known as Cli-Fi has been a significant development not only in publishing, but in global environmental politics, representing the late arrival of literary storytelling to the ongoing struggle to safeguard a livable climate for our species and for millions of others. Okay, time for some questions. My first question is on personal experience. Because I live in New York City, I'm worried about sea level rise as the glaciers continue to melt and our increasing vulnerability to megastorms, and the flooding of our infrastructure, like the subway system, and our homes. Indeed, last fall, 13 New Yorkers died by drowning in their apartments, in their basement apartments during Hurricane Ida. How have you experienced global warming in your home places? And how has that affected what you've chosen to write?
Should I start? Yeah, well, I live in Oslo, the capital of Norway, and when I started to write my first novel in 2013, I remember doing research which told me that Norway would probably have a lot more rain. Because the climate experts tell us that we will have more of what they already have, and Oslo is quite wet. What is strange, though, is that the last couple of years has actually been extremely dry. So right now in Oslo, there's almost no, I mean, we haven't had any rain for almost 4 months. So we have started to, there's less and less water, and it's really sort of, it's scary. We feel it every day. Luckily, I think they had 1 day of rain last week, so hopefully I'll come home to a bit greener city, but it's still so extremely dry.
It reminds me of your book.
Yeah, I live in Staten Island, and I'm from Colorado, so two very different places that are both experiencing climate change in ways that feel opposite sometimes. So sometimes there's this challenge, I think, in thinking about my two places of linking the two under the same sort of phenomenon, because one feels wet and cold and crumbly, and the other is dry and combustible. Where I live on Staten Island on the North Shore, we had a lot of flooding during Sandy. The first floor of our building was 3 feet underwater. And even now, there are sinkholes, there are the constant sort of changes in the way I walk to work that are governed by the erosion that's happening below the ground that my house sits on, So it's in some ways a daily concern, but one thing that's really surprised me is how easy it is to normalize that too. For the first week that a sinkhole opened up on my walk to the ferry, I was very disturbed, and on the second week, I found a new way to walk, So I think part of what I'm interested in doing is working against that feeling of normalization that I feel happening quite quickly within me, and keeping alive the sense that we are living in emergency, and asking myself what that means for me and for the way that I do my daily activities.
I think that normalization point is so well taken, because, so I'm from Connecticut, and that's where I live currently, and I joke with loved ones all the time that, you know, the way things stand now, we're probably the safest place to be in the United States. Topographically, you know, we have a type of landscape that isn't too amenable to hurricanes and tornadoes and things of that sort. You know, we don't really get fires the way that they do out west. There are parts of New England that get worse flooding than we do. And so, you know, all things considered, it doesn't look nearly as biblical as it does in other parts of the country. But I think that opens the door to normalizing it and thinking, oh, this just means unseasonable, you know, temperatures in winter. It means, oh, we don't get a white Christmas, right? But one of the things that'll happen is that it'll show up in odd ways. So there were a couple winters back, we got a really, really, really bad snowstorm. I want to say in maybe early to late October. And what ended up happening was that the snow weighed down on the tree branches so much that they took out all the power lines, and almost 1 million people in Connecticut were without power for a week. And the reason that this happened was because the leaves hadn't completely fallen off the trees yet. And so they caught all that snow, and all of a sudden you have this huge infrastructure crisis because snow came earlier than usual. And so that's something that I've tried to sort of keep my eye out for. You know, we don't get the apocalyptic sort of indicators of climate change the way that other parts of the country do, but it is real, and it's very much impacting the way that we're living our lives.
Yeah, you feel that when the lights go out. My second question has to do with structuring time in fiction. Maja, your last book has 3 timelines, past, present, and future, yoked together by the story of a breed of ancient horses brought back from near extinction and then near extinction again. Alexandra, your new novel seems to be set in the very near future in the state of California, where the water supply has run out. And Tochi, your book is set in a future dystopia with many parallels to the present in its preoccupations with the plagues of race, class, and gentrification, to which the climate crisis works as a threat multiplier. Can you each tell us about why and how you decided on these timelines as the best climate narrative strategy for your particular themes?
Sure. So, you know, I was born and raised in science fiction and fantasy. This is where I cut my teeth. It's where I learned character development, you know, plot movement, all the things that you learn over the course of trying to figure out how to tell a story. And so it made sense that if I were to engage with an issue like climate change, it would be in this sort of format. One of the ways in which it sort of became very real for me was I, with Goliath, wanted to write myself and my generation into the future. I was going to say when I'm an adult, but, you know, 30 years from now, inshallah, I'll still be alive. The world is going to look very different than how it does now because of climate change. And I wanted to imagine that. You know, for kids that are in high school now, what's 30 years from now going to look like? You know, for kids that are little now, when they get to my age, what's that going to look like? And that was like a really surprising but also terrifying question to ask. And so with science fiction, I didn't want to write a future that was so far beyond that I could, you know, have readers sort of dismissing the urgency of the climate stuff in there. I wanted to write something that conceivably we'd all be alive to experience. Although I really hope it doesn't turn out that way. But yeah, that's sort of what drove a lot of the decisions that I made temporally in the book.
I love that answer because I also relate with the idea of growing up reading science fiction and fantasy. I grew up reading a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction, which shaped me in more ways than I can probably count, and more ways than I can disentangle totally. But in some sense, the desire to write a near-future novel was a response to that, because I always felt like there was something obviously very frightening about a post-apocalyptic novel, but strangely comforting too, that it was always pushed off into the far future, that it was separated from our own by a sort of cataclysmic event that you could name, and that clearly hasn't happened to us yet, well, depending on where you stand. And in that way, I think it allows us to be, in some ways, even more comfortable in our present, because it does seem like that possible future is so far from the one in which we live our lives. So I wanted to write a near-future novel where the reader would always have to decide, oh, is this writing about our time, or is this writing about the future, and have that question in their mind continuously. I also have to say, though, that there are some challenges to writing a near-future novel. I'm writing about Los Angeles, and a Los Angeles that's really riddled with wildfires. And when I started writing, I was drawing on my memories from childhood, where I used to live in the San Gabriel Valley and used to occasionally drive past a small wildfire on the hill off the side of the highway, which I'd look at and wonder, well, if it's an emergency, why aren't people reacting? So I tried to magnify that and embed it in the world of my novel. By the time I was editing it, I was in Colorado, and Colorado was suffering 3 of the largest wildfires in state history. So the sky was red. You couldn't go anywhere without smelling bonfire on you all the time. It was continual, it was oppressive, and I realized I hadn't aimed far enough, and I had imagined that the future was further away than it actually is.
Yes, for me, it actually started with the story of the horses, and with the whole quartet, because my quartet is like a big jigsaw puzzle with all these different pieces that are actually, one picture, all the 4 books take place both in the past, in the present, and the future, and it's always sort of the story that decides for me what will happen. And with The Last Wild Horses, it was the horses, because I tell the true story about how these horses were discovered in Mongolia back in the 1880s, and how they were taken to Europe, and how they were almost extinct. And then, as you say, they were taken back to Mongolia. They managed to breed from only 13 individual horses. They managed to breed new horses again, and to introduce them to Mongolia again. And then I also write about the future where there are only 2 horses left. So it always starts with a story. And in the 4th book, actually, the one I've just finished that will be published in Norway this autumn, I actually only write in the future. The whole scenario is almost in. I have a few backstories from the past, but mostly from the future. But I think, for me, it's always the characters, it's always the stories, it's always being true to that. And I never really saw myself as sort of an author writing from the future. So with my first novel, The History of Bees, it took some courage. I remember it was quite easy to write from the past and the present, and it took me a while to sort of dive into the future and to realize that stories from the future can be, they don't necessarily have to be science fiction. You don't have to invent new cool technological stuff or new cars that can fly or anything like that. With my first novel, I realized that I wrote about a mother and a son, and the son was the same age as my youngest at that time. And when I realized that I was actually writing a relationship story, and I was writing about a mother who lost her child, and I went into these emotions, then I was able to write from the future.
I take your point. I think because Cli-Fi sounds so much like sci-fi that you get kind of confused for one another, but climate fiction doesn't need to employ any of the strategies of science fiction. And that leads me to my next question, which is on genre. So at a bookstore in Cornwall a few years ago, a bookseller posted a sign saying that the apocalyptic fiction section had been moved to current events. I was at a bookstore yesterday with my son here in New York City where there was another sign, this one posted with that Emerson quote, "Fiction reveals truth that reality obscures." In this era of global weirding, why write climate fiction instead of nonfiction? For example, do you feel there are truths that fiction can reveal about the climate crisis that nonfiction cannot? I ask this as a nonfiction writer.
I can try to start. Well, fiction is all about feelings. When you read a novel, you read with your heart, and you're actually in the situation. You see the world through the character that you're reading about. And you are there. You are walking in a dry landscape. You feel the wildfires, or the thirst, or you're scared with the character. And nonfiction can't do that in the same way. And for me, I'm not a politician. I have never written nonfiction in my entire life. I'm a screenwriter and an author. I wouldn't know how to write nonfiction, you know. So for me, it's always the stories. It's always the characters. It's always about being there, feeling what they feel, being thirsty when they are thirsty, and cold when they are cold in Mongolia, for example, and being true to that.
Yeah, I completely vibe with that answer. I read so much climate-related reporting when writing the book, more so in some ways than novels that were feeding the book. But I think part of the reason why I wanted to write about the climate crisis in fiction is because, for one thing, it's a place where you dwell in the feelings and sensations that go along with the problem. And I think that this act of dwelling, when I write about it, helps me understand where I am more fully. And it helps me feel like I'm communicating something like deep and essential that I feel about it. At the same time, in my novel, I get to be about 4 or 5 different characters, and they're spread out over the United States. My main character is in Los Angeles. His wife is on the East Coast in an eco-commune. And I think that this allows me to get at some of the other strange feelings that go along with being in this crisis and this time. For example, having a loved one experience disaster while you are experiencing a beautiful spring day, for example. These strangenesses, this desire and longing we might have to understand the crisis that is immediately with someone else, but which sort of goes against what our senses are telling us and what the immediate and sensible security of our own position seems to be telling us. I think these are the mental stretches that we need to be able to do to begin wrapping our mind around how vast this is, how it affects people differently, and how, in many ways, the climate apocalypse is already arrived for vulnerable populations, island populations. It's not distributed equally.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer for me is that fiction is what I'm good at. So, if I had the skills, then maybe nonfiction would be where I would sort of engage with these subjects more. But I also do think that there is a power in fiction to expand emotive imagination, and I distinguish that from empathy, about which I have very complicated feelings when it comes to fiction. But I do think that encountering something in fiction, leaves someone indelibly changed, and not necessarily in ways that we're able to articulate even to ourselves. And so, sure, there was a lot of nonfiction and reportage about, the African American condition before Barack Obama, but I think it'd be a lie to say that the fiction of Toni Morrison didn't play any role in allowing people to engage in the idea of an African American United States president, if that makes any sense. And so I feel like similarly with something like climate change, where it is very much this hyper object, this thing that's so large, it's almost beyond the capacity of our minds to comprehend, that fiction is a way to make that sort of thing, if not digestible, then comprehensible. You know, we can span all sorts of, you know, time frames in our stories in the way that we wouldn't necessarily be able to in nonfiction. Like, I don't know what the world's going to look like in 2050. I can surmise and make some assumptions based off the IPCC reports, but in fiction, I can turn 2050 into a lived reality.
Did you have another thing to add?
Well, yeah, I think for the readers, you know, they can really be there, and it's just that's the magic of fiction, that they can feel it, and also when they feel it, they might want to change. Even though I'm quite often asked, "What's your message?" I don't know what my message is. I never think about the messages when I write. But I know that readers go out, after reading, some readers at least tell me that they have actually changed the way they look at the world, and that's sort of a gift they give back to me. So yeah, fiction can do something that nothing else can do, and that's why it's so important as well.
I think fiction writers are often led by their characters and emotions, as you've been talking about, in terms of crafting plot, but also in the power of metaphor and extended metaphor. And I was interested to hear you talk about the horses with us, because Tochi also uses horses in his plot. And I wonder, Tochi, if you could speak a little bit on the level of metaphor about how the wild horses in your book serve on the level of metaphor, and maybe what they're in contrast to, because your book really gets at some meaty issues of inequality in terms of race and class and politics. So what's with the horses?
It's funny, we were joking about this before the panel, that like Alex's next book needs to feature horses because it's what all the cool kids are doing. I think for me, there was something magical about the incongruity of horses in an urban environment, and I was thinking a lot about the idea of the concrete cowboys in Philly, and these kids that after school would hang out at these stables that were basically built up in their neighborhoods, and they would take care of horses, and they would learn how to ride horses, and that completely flies against so much of the sort of common mythology that we imbibe and that we consider with regards to America and American history. And who gets to ride on a horse. And so another thing that I wanted to do was have this kind of, this statement from the horses being in the book is sort of that, magic can happen here too. Because it makes no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever, especially in a book that's supposed to be so grounded in scientific fact and what have you. It makes no sense for those horses to be where they are. But I feel like, particularly in our personal experience with nature and with the environment, there's so much that we encounter that we can't necessarily make sense of. Like, how on earth is this thing as beautiful as it is? What did that? And my experience of that, like how, why, it's all questions, right? When you're faced with the overwhelming beauty of a thing. But I also think I wanted to use the horses as ciphers in a sense, because all the characters have different reactions and relationships to the horses. The horses in many ways reveal things to characters about themselves, and it's weird. It's a common thing that I've seen in so much fiction, whether in prose or on TV, about horses, is that it just like changes a person being in the presence of a horse. And I don't know why that is. It's just every single time. And the same thing has like happened to me personally. Every single time, it's fascinating to watch. Like, just watch someone interact with a horse, and you can't say that something special isn't happening there.
Okay, my next question is for you, Alex. Could you tell us a little more about how you went about presenting the problem of overconsumption in your work? I'm thinking about the synthetic water in your novel and wondering in what ways you're extrapolating forward in time based on present concerns about water shortages in the West.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, my book takes place in our world with few changes, but there is one big speculative addition, which is a synthetic form of water that I call WAT-R, W-A-T-R, that was developed to quickly address the problem of major water shortage in the metropolitan area of Los Angeles. And on the one hand, this is a speculative problem because I don't think Los Angeles has come close to experiencing this. And it's speculative also because probably the cheapest solution is desalination, or there's talk of building a pipeline from the Great Lakes all the way to LA. I don't know. But I think that it's realistic in one particular way, which is that we've adapted our habits of consumption to fit a pace that is really unsustainable and that has to be mostly unconscious, I think. We consume before we consciously decide we're going to consume, and we expect water to come from the faucet instantly when we turn that faucet. This leaves little room for thinking about where that water comes from, what the source is, what it takes or costs to get it there. And the time when we really understand the history of that resource or that material is when there's a breakdown in the supply. For example, in Mendocino County in California last summer, they were trucking water in from a neighboring county because their own supplies were down. So, you know, on the one hand, I do think it reflects something true about the way we consume, but on the other hand, I think the idea is also to get you to see concretely how you're consuming and slow down that process for yourself, clog it up so that it becomes visible and becomes something that you can make a personal decision about.
I was thinking about your book just yesterday, Alex, while reading an article in the New Yorker called "The Biggest Potential Water Disaster in the U.S." I don't know if you saw that. It describes the threat posed to the Bay Delta by saltwater intrusion as the ocean rises, and also by the Western drought. That delta provides fresh water for tens of millions of Californians, and it's projected to be possibly unusable. So I take to heart what you're saying about, you know, it's not a far leap to imagine what you're imagining in your book. Maja and Tochi, I wonder if you could also tell us more about some of the threatened resources, species, and landscapes you choose to explore in your work. Maja, perhaps you could touch on the previous book, and Tochi, Beyond the Horses, maybe about the resources under threat and what's going on with the characters to preserve what's left.
Well, I actually don't call my books climate fiction. I just call them novels. I think it's up to the reader, really, to decide. And also, a reason why I don't call them climate fiction is that I actually write more about endangered species than I write about climate. Climate is sort of a part of it, and especially the second book, The End of the Ocean, is very much a climate. It's about water and lack of water, like yours as well. But the first novel is about the importance of pollinating insects, and especially bees, and colony collapse disorder, which you might have heard about. So yes, and the third one is about endangered animals, with these horses as sort of the specific example. But it's also about us. And in Germany, actually, the book is called The Last of Its Kind, which I think is a wonderful title. I like The Last Wild Horses as well, but I mean, that title can point to both us and the horses. So I guess what I'm trying to do for the whole quartet is to ask two questions. And the first one is, how come we are the one that ended up ruling and changing this world so much? What's in us? Why Homo sapiens? And do we have it in us? Do we have the abilities to make up for our mistakes? I'm not sure. I don't have the answers. But these are the questions I sort of start to... I've started to see that these are the questions I'm always asking.
Yeah, so in Goliath, the resource in question is air. There's a combination climate event, nuclear event, that renders a lot of the air in the continental United States unbreathable. And if you want clean air, you have to live in a dome. And it's not a large leap to go from redlining and segregation to who gets to live in a dome and who doesn't, where these domes get placed and where they don't. Also a complicating factor, there are space colonies that if you're wealthy and you can afford it, you can just sort of head up and have your acclimatized environment and all of that stuff. But what ends up happening is space gets domesticated, and so you have a lot of the next generation of colonists in space deciding, oh, I want to go back to Earth. That's where the real action is. They do their whole homesteader thing, where they're like, okay, I'm going to go back to Earth. I'm going to make a life for myself. I'm going to fix my relationship. I'm going to, get out from under this bounty that's on my head. Whatever the justification in old westerns was. But what was interesting to me was, at first it seemed like a really sort of out there thing to have air or breathable air as a precious like I started the book in 2015. Before I was really thinking about all of this stuff, before I was cognizant of the wildfires and the increasing intensity and speed of those wildfires out west, before a respiratory pandemic, before I even knew about things like the fact that certain types of housing will be built on the side of freeways and highways. And if you look at those residences, you'll see a sharp increase in the rates of asthma because of the people that live there have to constantly be breathing in the exhaust of the cars that are going by. And that's urban planning. And so it all just sort of came together for me. It's funny, even before I started writing Goliath, I didn't really think of climate change as like this big existential threat, because at the time, we were inundated with all these videos of officer-involved killings of Black Americans. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, what does it matter if there's a planet or not, if like this could happen to me tomorrow? But then the more that I wrote the book and the more research that I did, I was like, wait a second, it's all connected. If you look at some urban neighborhoods, the temperature during the summer will consistently be several degrees higher than in their suburban counterparts, and a lot of that is because in those neighborhoods they don't have trees. Something as simple as that, and that's redlining, and that's race. Like it all sort of came together, and being able to breathe seemed to me the most sort of dramatic metaphor that I could come up with for that situation.
Thank you. My next question is about the larger climate conversation. What, if anything, do you hope your books will accomplish in that conversation? Are you hoping to inspire action amongst your readers, affirm grim realities so that readers feel less alone, raise awareness, or wake people up? Or combination of these? Do you find you've become a talking head about this issue? If so, does that bother you? I
mean, people are trying to turn me into a talking head. I'm not a climate dude. I'm just a dude who wrote a book about the climate. No, but I think, more seriously, I mean, one of the biggest themes of the book, particularly because it concerns the people that are left behind and the people that sort of the government or authorities or whoever have abandoned, which is the situation for a lot of Americans right now. It's this idea that personal joy or moments of individual rapture or happiness or the ability to fall in love or the ability to appreciate a sunset, like those don't ever go away. As long as there are some of us here, there's going to be that. And that to me was probably the most effective balm to whatever genre of climate despair I was experiencing while writing and researching this book, was that we're never going to stop being able to fall in love. And that was powerful to me.
I really like that as an antidote to the fear that we'll never be able to stop our addiction to fossil fuels. It feels truer to me that we'll never be able to stop falling in love. Yeah.
Yeah, I really love that answer, and remembering that there's joy almost unavoidably at some point, even in the worst of situations, I think, is part of what makes a future that has a space for that seem more realistic, and therefore the scary things can seem more scary, too, as a result. One thing I really wanted to do in this book was have a sort of conversation about climate grief. One of the books that I read in researching this was a sociological study actually conducted in Norway, where a sociologist went over and talked to people about climate, talked to people about why they don't talk about climate change, talked to people about how it makes them feel not to talk about it. And the outcome of the book was basically that social norms, such as keeping conversation pleasant, keep us from talking about these things that are very much on our mind. And in that way, they keep us from having a shared experience around them, and they keep us feeling alone and even more helpless in our thoughts and daily feelings about climate catastrophe. So in my book, characters are trying to deal with a feeling that the environment is changing around them and beneath them in different ways. One is, in some sense, prepping for a resource-scarce future. Another has joined an eco-commune where people mourn for the daily losses in the environment, and others are blithely ignoring it, which is also, I think, a common response. And I think to just depict different ways that people are trying to deal and letting us sort out for ourselves which we think is the best, which is productive, what our own way would be, what frustrates you about the way that this character is doing it, is part of first making that conversation a little bit easier to have among people. You can have it over the book if it's hard to have it at the grocery store checkout line. And part of making it feel like we have a shared problem rather than individual anxieties.
Yeah, I feel the same actually. For me, literature can be a mirror, and that's what readers talk to me about as well. Thank you for describing my feelings. And I'm so glad you're doing this, because now I don't feel that alone. And so for me, I'm actually kind of a talking head in Norway when it comes to this. But also, I even appreciate more, I think, to get the feedback from readers talking about feelings, because we need a language for this, and we need to speak about it a lot.
That leads to my next and last question, which is about feelings on a deeper level. I recently heard someone describe the potential for hope in climate writing, hope as an active verb. In my own writing on climate change, I sometimes struggle to achieve the right balance between hope and despair. Before he died, the environmental writer Barry Lopez wrote me a letter about this struggle. In the letter, he said, "Perhaps one of the problems we're having as writers around this issue is that we don't know how to paint a dark enough picture and then follow this with an evocation of humanity's strengths that empowers or animates people sufficiently to keep them from caving in the face of the dark picture." You've touched on this a little already, but I wonder if you can go a little further about what emotion or emotions govern your individual books. Grief, rage, horror, hope, love, bewilderment, a combination of these. What feeling do you want to leave your readers with?
All of them. No, but with Goliath, in many ways, that book is a response to my earlier book, Riot Baby. Riot Baby emotionally is pitched at a very particular emotional register and basically just goes up from there. And so much of that book is defined by constriction and claustrophobia, and with Goliath I wanted to, in many ways, write its structural opposite. And I think in writing a bigger book, I wanted to access, or be able to access, more emotional registers. So Goliath is also the funniest thing I've ever written. It's so, like, there are parts that even just, like, thinking about it now, I, like, have to keep myself from laughing. Like, there are some jokes in there and some stories that, like, literally, I'm like, how did this come out of me? It's so funny. And, and like, that's something that I think I want a reader to be able to experience when reading the book. Like, a lot of the book is despair, and a lot of the book is heartache, and a lot of the book is like a lack of hope in people's individual situations, because it feels in many ways dishonest to me to tell people, or to tell a person who's in a really messed up situation, that it's going to get better, especially if there's no evidence or indication that that thing is going to get better, or I don't know about any external factors that are going to actively improve that person's situation. It almost feels like a lie to tell them, oh, like, hope in this thing, but I can give them a moment of relief in the present. I can do something to, like, alleviate that feeling of crippling loneliness. I can let somebody see themselves mirrored in something else. And, like, that to me, it's almost like heaven isn't necessarily somewhere you're going to, it's a place that you have to create for yourself in the moment. And if you can just, like, have moments like that almost, I don't know, it's so powerful. And I feel like for so many people who may not necessarily have the means to enact immediately the type of measures that would reverse the effects of climate change, right? Like, I'm not the head of ExxonMobil. Like, what am I going to do, right? I have green bins and blue bins. Like, that's all I'm able to do, right? But, like, if you can help a person sort of engineer their own moments of deliverance, like, that I think is super empowering.
Okay, you heard it here, folks. If you are suffering from climate grief and you need a laugh, buy Tochi's book, Goliath, at the table in the back after this panel. All right, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I already spoke about the grief element, but I think it also gets back to, what Tochi was saying earlier, too, about depicting a possible future, even if there's catastrophe in it, that involves a range of emotions, because otherwise these places don't seem real to us. They seem like a nightmare, something that you can push aside when you're done. So in my book there is also a lot of absurdity, some humor. For me, when writing it, the humor was a thing that I used to keep myself continuing on, to pop the bubble of tension that was growing in me, and to keep me feeling like, okay, I can go back into this hard spot and find out what's there. But I also, I feel this isn't my most hopeful book, but I had moments of hope, especially while writing it, as I was researching the landscape that I was writing in, because just as during the pandemic when we were not doing things indoors with other people, I started volunteering with a wilderness restoration organization. I started seeing how much there was in the field of seemingly like intermingled generic grasses, like so many different species, so many native species, so many species with interesting histories, species that came from different places, all there, and reminding me of the sort of plenitude that is there too. And so that's something, when I think about, it sticks with me from Maja's book on bees, the scene that opens it where people are hand-pollinating the fruit trees. And it's so difficult, but it also reminds you that we are still living in a time of abundance, and that there's a lot that is precious and wonderful here that we can make use of.
Yeah, I feel the same way, but thank you for reading my book. If my book can make the reader love nature a bit more, that would be wonderful. And when it comes to hope, my mother used to tell me I was such a happy kid. You were always so happy. I'm still happy. I'm still quite happy, actually. I'm sort of glass is half full instead of half empty. I think I'm born that way. And I don't know if I would manage to write about these dark themes without sort of having that light in me. That said, I can be quite pessimistic when it comes to the future, and I think it's probably the same for you. The more you read, the more numbers you see, the more you get into it, the darker it gets, really. This is also a question about knowledge. But on the other hand, I do believe man has some traits that can help us, and I think we have shown it during the pandemic. We are good at solutions, we are good at collaborating, we are good at communication. So I would say I'm positive every second day and, negative, depressed every second day. And I think my novels reflect that as well. It's sort of always open endings.
Thank you so much. So we're moving to the portion of the evening where there's time for questions from the audience. I guess there's a mic up here for anyone to use who has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing today and also for writing the books that you've written. I was really struck by the conversation around art and especially fiction to move people and to help them grieve and to help them see the beauty around them. And had a question, I think it's a craft question. It's one I think about when writing, which is how to find the balance between opening someone's heart to everything, the grief, the beauty, and then, not just beating the heart to death, essentially. I'm thinking of Get Up, Don't Look Up, Dwight Garner's review of Bewilderment a couple months back. And yeah, just wondering how you approach it as you're writing maybe the last projects or the current projects that you're working on, how to find that balance.
Oh, it's interesting. In a conversation with Maja that I happened to listen in on earlier, she said something interesting that really resonated with me, which is that you don't really write for a reader, you just sort of write for yourself. And what was fascinating was I found myself articulated in that exact sentiment. I'm not really thinking about a particular reader when I write. I'm really only writing the book that I want to have walked into a library and picked up off a shelf. And so when I'm thinking about, the balance between, human experience and message, I'm not really necessarily thinking about what somebody's going to take out of my book. And I'm thinking more about what am I feeling while writing this book? And also, too, what's the most dramatic way of getting into and getting out of a situation? I'm all about drama. Not in real life, but in my fiction, in the craft, I'm all about chasing drama and, trying to create stakes and trying to find the most dynamic and dramatic way of saying, or not even saying, but demonstrating something even. And I think that's been the guiding principle for me.
Yeah, you just said what I said. Yeah, I don't think about the reader. It sounds a bit strange when you say it out loud, but really I think about the story. I think about writing a book that I would like to read. I'm my first reader. And also, no, it's always about the story. It's always about being on the inside, feeling it, and trying to make it as true as you can. And yeah, just being there. And then the readers have to read the story there are as many versions of a novel as there are readers. So everyone finds different things.
Yeah, I think I do think about the reader sometimes. I'm not sure it helps me. Maybe it trips me up sometimes. But I think a lot of the reason I write is also, in relation to myself. I see it as a signal that I send out, I beam out, and hopefully other people will see it and respond. They'll see something of themselves in that. And that's how connections get made. But one thing that's really important to me about writing fiction is that it's not just a bucket of grief or something. It has progression. And so if you pass through a place of grief, you're necessarily going to have to take it someplace else in order for the plot to advance. And when I was writing this last book, Something New Under the Sun, I was trying to first write myself into that space where I could experience a lot of what I was feeling. And then I knew that I would have to write myself out of it into another place. Maybe not a wholly positive place, but someplace different. It's a way of pushing myself from one feeling to another, too. And I choose projects sometimes on that basis, because the next book that I'm working on, I want to think of it as a very cautiously utopian novel, by which I mean there's some hope in it. And I choose that project in part because I want to train myself to think that way. I think about a book like Parable of the Sower, which is a book I really love that contains within it a lot of darkness. It also contains within it like the seed of a philosophy that drives its main character to try to rebuild the world in some way, to define the world. And I think this idea that we're not just living in the world, but we're also building it is something I want to figure out how to really make and absorb into myself. So sometimes I give myself assignments based on who I want to be in the future.
Thanks for bringing up Octavia Butler, who was so prophetic in this realm. Other questions in the audience? Where's the mic?
Thank you for that. Thank you for this conversation. I'm right here. So I actually had a question that jumps right off what Alexandra was just saying, because a climate journalist wrote this essay, I think in The Atlantic, that was about how speculative fiction often shows things going very wrong, and especially with climate, humans destroying the world that we live in, which of course mirrors society. But my question is, what responsibility do we have as fiction writers to also imagine a better future, imagine humans living in tune with the earth, and finding ways to do that? Because, as fiction writers, we really have the imagination that can help pave the way for what, scientists and engineers and everyone else decides to create.
Yeah, I'm very excited to read your next book, Alex. Exactly in response to that question. No, it's interesting. Like I hesitate on being sort of not dogmatic, but prescriptive about what I think people should or shouldn't write, because I think it's very easy to, just look at the history of own voices, for instance, or various other sort of in the beginning well-meaning initiatives to diversify publishing that have since turned into, okay, you're boxed into writing about this particular thing, and your mandate is to write about this. And so, connecting that back to the question, I think there are already going to be, and already are, writers geared towards writing those particular futures or imagining those futures. It's just a matter of them getting published. I think those people are already out there. And it's up to us to be able to find them and listen to them. I don't know if that's necessarily the most satisfying answer, but I know they're out there. I know those stories are out there.
Yeah, I think it gets into the question of when we tell a story about the future, on the one hand, we're giving our version or take on what it might be like, but as they accumulate and as they become a set of tropes, they start to feel like almost a factual account of what the future would be like if certain things in our world were gone. Like I think most post-apocalyptic novels tend to be buccaneer sort of stories. People are on their own. Maybe they're in small tribes when it's useful for them, but for the most part, it's a grim future. What about the possibility that in a time of crisis, we could care for one another at a greater and more generous level than we do now? I think that the significance of presenting that possibility is it allows us to imagine acting differently than how we're told everyone else will act in such a crisis. And it shapes behavior going forward, possibly. It makes people long for a different kind of future. So I wouldn't say that anyone has to write one particular thing, but there's a hunger for stories that show us other ways to live, speculative ways to live that we can begin making real in our own time, I think.
Yeah, and it's so hard to write a novel, and fun, I must say. I'm glad you emphasized that, how fun it can be to write. But it's so hard, you can't tell others what to write. Yeah, as an author, you sort of have to be free and write. In Norway, we say write where it burns. So I write where it burns. I think you do too.
We have time for 2 more questions.
I think this is a fairly related question. I think all of us who are thinking about this and writing about this are all struggling to find that balance between like joy and hopelessness. And so I think a related craft question to the first question, which is, as you're building your worlds in your kind of like climate fiction, especially, I think, Tochi, you're like 30 years from now future, how do you think about how far to go in terms of like how desolate the world is going, and what elements of all of our possible kind of climate affected futures you pull into the worlds you're building? I think for all of you, but I think, you know.
I don't know. I kind of put all of them in Goliath. You know, one of the points that I wanted to make was the sort of kaleidoscopic nature of the effects of climate change on the United States. You know, the Southwest is going to experience it way differently than the Northeast is going to experience it differently from, you know, the Mid-Atlantic is going to experience it differently from what parts of Florida and Louisiana remain in 30 years. And so I guess, you know, I put all the gradations in there. Yeah, like I didn't really, yeah, I put it all in there. That was my answer. That's how I hedged, was that, okay, I don't know if it's going to be just this, it might also be this, so like let me put that in there too. And then let me put that in there too just to be safe. And okay, let me just round it out with this other thing. So I kind of cheated.
Well, I do a lot of research when I work with both my past and present stories and my future stories as well. And I work with researchers, I use numbers, I use reports, and I actually try to describe a future. I try to describe the same future as, for example, the UN reports, only in fiction instead of in nonfiction. So, and I work my world around what will happen if we don't stop global warming. Or as with the history of bees, that one started out a bit differently than the 3 others, because in that one I just ask, what happens if all the pollinating insects on this planet disappear? And I always have this sort of core, and then I build the world around it.
Well, it's a good question. I personally never really know how desolate a place I've made is until someone tells me it was very desolate. So to some extent, I feel I don't have as much control over how these worlds end up. I also, like Maja sort of describes, choose a piece and I build the world out from that piece. And then it's up to someone else to tell me whether it made them feel very unhappy or not.
We have time for one last question. Here in the front.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for speaking here today. I wanted to ask, because the title of this talk was Climate Fiction at the Breaking Point, is there some kind of goading into action that you feel responsible or that you take without being didactic? Because I know when I was a kid, like fiction, like Planet of the Apes, had a specific kind of, maybe a little didactic message though, but there were definite messages and actions to take. Do you do that with your writing and fiction as well?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know that there's any sort of prescriptive action that Goliath is sort of putting forward, but related, and particularly going back to some of the fiction that you've mentioned in your question, I think all fiction is political, and that going to what's already been said on the panel, different people are going to take different interpretations or have different interpretations from your fiction. Attack on Titan, for instance, in the season 3 had this big reveal, and a big part of the population was like, oh, this is a commentary on anti-Semitism. And then another part of the population was like, no, this is an endorsement of anti-Semitism. And wildly opposite interpretations of this particular twist in this story. And so I think, people may come to Goliath and be like, oh, I need to do this, to prevent this future from happening. And then another person can come to Goliath and be like, no, I need to do that in order to prevent this future from happening. And so I don't know that, like, I'm also not a climate scientist. And so I don't know that there's one thing like, oh, we need to expand the width of sidewalks by 2 inches to reduce this thing and then increase that. Like, I just don't know. All I can do is just sort of put really cool stories out there.
Yeah, I mean, I also feel like my book isn't advocating a particular course of action, and that the course of action might be different for you based on where you're positioned in the world, what you feel you're good at, what would feed a sense of that you're acting in a way that's true to yourself. When I read the title, like at the breaking point, one thing that I think of is that climate fiction, which is still a fairly new term, has been cordoned off from other kinds of fiction and related to science fiction. It's an unusual or specific area of exploration. And what I see more and more is that the idea of climate fiction is breaking out of that category and entering what we would call standard realist novels, what we would call all sorts of things, because we can no longer keep writing about worlds that are artificially stable, where climate change isn't a concern in the minds of any of its inhabitants, where our idea of reality hasn't kept up with the changes that we see around us. So I think more and more fiction is going to become climate fiction in that sense, or we just recognize that the world as we knew it is changing and will have a different shape.
Yeah, for me, as I said earlier, I think I don't really know what my message is. And especially when I write, I don't think about messages at all, since I don't think about the reader either. But when I talk about my books, I have messages. And I'm glad to see that the books open eyes and hearts. And I think one thing especially important to me is nature, love of nature. And that if readers actually start to value other species on this planet and to see that they deserve to be here as well, as much as we do, and that they have a place on this planet as well, and are not only here as tools for us to use. If readers get that, that makes me grateful.
Thank you. We're at the end of our panel discussion and Q&A. There will be a book signing in the back with these authors. I just want to add that there are additional events as part of this festival, and you can find information about those events at the Penn World Voices Festival website, which is penn.org/festival. please join me in thanking these authors for sharing their worlds with us.